and welcome to the ICT Pulse podcast. I'm Michele Marius, your host, and the editor and publisher of ICT Pulse, the online platform where we discuss ICT issues from a Caribbean perspective. The topic for today's discussion is the IT, business process outsourcing, BPO industry in the Caribbean. Since the 2008 global financial crisis, Caribbean countries have been struggling to jumpstart their economies, which have suffered from, among other things, high unemployment rates, particularly among the youth, marginal and even stagnant economic growth, and low government revenues. To that end, many Caribbean countries have been eager to promote themselves as suitable locations for offshore outsourcing, BPO, an industry that, many believe, can bolster their economies and generate jobs. To help us explore this issue, we have Rejo Sam, the Associate Director of Avasant at its Trinidad and Tobago office, which serves the Latin America and Caribbean region. Avasant is a management consulting firm that is consistently recognized as one of the leading advisors in the outsourcing space. It works with many governments and companies worldwide on matters related to strategy, location selection, and managed governance, to name a few. Rejo, thank you so much for agreeing to help us get a better understanding of BPO and BPO in the Caribbean.
Thanks, Michelle. It's a pleasure to be on this podcast with you, and thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak with you and your audience.
So I guess one of the things I think we probably need to do is to dispel a belief that I think many people have, that outsourcing is something novel or unique. Virtually all businesses outsource various aspects of their operations, mainly because it doesn't make sense for them to do some jobs in-house. However, what are some of the reasons that are driving businesses to outsource on such a scale that, it has become such a global industry that is still growing? And, what has changed over the years?
Sure. So to respond to this question, I would probably go back a little bit into the history of the entire concept of outsourcing and how it has evolved over time, especially in the services space, because I think it's very important to understand how this entire thing of services outsourcing, or concept of outsourcing, services outsourcing started. So, the concept of outsourcing as we know it has been there for a very, very long time. There was a time when goods were manufactured in other locations which were cheaper, where you would manufacture these goods and then, you'll bring it back to your home location and then sell it at whatever cost you would want. And this was possible because manufacturing hubs were located all over the world. And when this entire concept was then transposed into the services sector, largely because of the innovation that happened within the larger ICT space. When I say the larger ICT space, I'm talking about the telecom, the telephony, the connectivity in terms of internet, increase in bandwidth, and so on and so forth. It actually gave rise to what we would know as the outsourcing of services. Now, this connectivity enabled work to be moved from the home location or the end client location to a remote location anywhere in the world, where it could be done at a much more cost-effective manner and then transferred back to the home location. And that is how the entire gamut of services outsourcing started to evolve. And this is a long time back. We did have some amount of basic outsourcing happening, and the concept that I explained is essentially called as offshore outsourcing, because you are offshoring your work to a remote location. However, what has happened over time is the complexity and the kind of work that gets offshore has become very, very complex and very, very, I would say, dense. It started off with elementary work, but now a lot of the companies offshore, or rather outsource, a lot of their work which is beyond what you would otherwise call as back office operations. So to answer your question, how did this entire outsourcing industry began and what was the reason for it to start? It started off with cost, as in cost saving being the key motivating factor. But of late, over the past 10 years, cost has become much more a secondary aspect of offshore outsourcing, or I would say nearshore outsourcing, or any of the other aspects of outsourcing, But what has become more important is to leverage outsourcing as a lever to innovate, to drive your strategic objectives, to get access to better resources, technologies, and so on and so forth. So to simply answer your question, what started off as a simple cost saving exercise has become much more intense and much more widespread, where companies are now looking at deriving much more strategic benefits out of an outsourcing engagement.
Understood. So since we are talking about outsourcing, I think most people in the region tend to focus on call centers. I'm sure you have gone into meetings, and you're talking with many officials in particular, or just a layperson. And as much as you may talk about, let's say, BPO or shared services, everybody just thinks of call centers. Could you just help us to differentiate between, terms like call centers, BPO, shared services, and probably any other terms that you think that we ought to be paying attention to?
Sure. So I just explained the entire concept of outsourcing. Now, the entire gamut of outsourcing has numerous subsegments which are outsourced depending on what the end client requires and what the service location offers. And I completely agree with your reference there to the Caribbean region, where the BPO industry or the outsourcing industry is pretty much equated to the call center industry. This, however, is not correct, because the call center industry is actually a very small subsegment of the larger BPO industry, and the BPO industry is further a very small subsegment of the larger outsourcing or technology outsourcing industry. So I would just spend some time trying to explain all these key terms. So when you talk about call centers, you're talking about our customer service centers or contact centers. You're talking about a specific segment of your customer service operations being moved to an offshore location, and this specific segment deals with satisfying your customers' service requirements. That would be essentially taking care of their services requests, or maybe providing some kind of support over phone, and so on and so forth. So it is essentially providing customer service using voice as the main channel. Now, that is just one small aspect of it. The entire BPO segment, as we know it, as business process outsourcing, takes care or deals with the entire back office operations of a specific industry or a specific company that is willing to outsource its operations. That would include not only call centers, but also any other kind of back office operations that a company might need to support its core operations. This could include HR support functions, finance and accounting support functions, other ways and means to support your customers. So that could include, things like email support, chat support, things which are not predominantly voice-based. It could include things like transcription services. It could even include collections. It could include social media management. You can also then go very specific to medical transcription and so on and so forth. So this entire segment of services is what is called the business process outsourcing segment as we know it. Now, the concept of shared services is again fundamentally different from either the call center or the business process outsourcing segment. As businesses grew, some of them had multiple locations, multiple functions, and so on and so forth. And there would be certain type of activity that they would need to service their requests for each of these locations. So just to give you an example, if I have an office here in Trinidad, and then I have an office in Jamaica, and then let's say I have another office in Barbados, because I am a pan-Caribbean conglomerate, I would have to provide finance and accounting support to all these three locations. So would I have to provide HR and personnel support to all these locations. This would mean I would have to have different teams at all these locations doing pretty much the same task. Now that was being very distributed, which means it was much more costly to provide these services. That's when the concept of shared services started evolving. So many of the companies started thinking, what if we could actually consolidate many of these back office support functions into one location so that we can gain by the economies of scale? So instead of having a finance and accounting team in all the three locations of, let's say, 10 people each, what I would do is I would have one location, let's say in Jamaica, I would have just 15 people doing finance and accounting for the entire group for all the three locations instead of having a total of 30 people around all these three locations. So that is essentially the concept of what is called shared services. The concept of shared services is usually relevant to very large firms, firms which have hundreds and thousands of employees, because you do need to have a certain amount of critical mass before you actually start gaining from the benefits, or you can start deriving the benefits of having consolidated all of your back office functions to a single location or multiple locations.
Okay. And just in some way, circling back to the discussion we had about the evolution of outsourcing, I just wanted to highlight and have us discuss what I think has been a long-standing fear across the Caribbean region about call centers, based on the experiences we had in the 1990s, where you had your foreign-based businesses getting great concessions from government who said that they wanted to set up some sort of call center. The employees were poorly paid, and virtually all of those businesses shut down without notice, leaving their employees and their service providers in a lurch. Are these concerns about call centers still valid?
That's a great question, especially with regards to the Caribbean. Again, I will go back a little bit into the history of the evolution of the call center industry here in the Caribbean, so that your audience has a better context. So, obviously, there are some the locations which are outright leaders in the various segments that we just spoke about: call center, BPOs. We did not discuss a lot about IT outsourcing, but that again is actually a very significant portion of the entire outsourcing spectrum, and in fact it's much larger than the BPO outsourcing segment. There are countries like India which actually covers the entire spectrum pretty much from end to end, and then you have countries like Philippines which focuses on the call center operations. Now, all this goes back to the fundamental question of where can I deliver a certain type of service most effectively in terms of cost. And that is how India came into picture, followed by Philippines. And then because of the segment that they were focusing on, especially the voice-based call center segments, these services required a lot of manpower. So this was something which was high volume but low value services. What does that mean? That means you would need a lot of manpower to execute these services, but you would not really get that significant a return in terms of your revenue, because this is something which is mostly repetitive, does not really require any specific skills other than your language being your most dependable asset or your strongest asset. Now, it was the stark socioeconomic change that the call center industry and further the BPO industry brought to these locations that made the Caribbean locations sit up and take notice. And the idea was, hey, if these countries which do not have English as their primary language could do this, we can definitely very well do this. And the other distinct advantage that we had as a Caribbean location was that we are much more closer to the American and the North American market, and to some extent, much more closer to the European market. So that is when the Caribbean countries started focusing on the expansion, or I would say starting to attract investment into the call center space. And obviously they did have a very strong value proposition, so a lot of the investors did come in, they did set up large scale operations. However, what happened in time and over time, as technologies improved, a lot more companies started getting onto the so-called outsourcing bandwagon. So just to give you an example, there would at least be 20 countries, in fact it would be 20 plus countries within just the Caribbean and Central American region who have the IT BPO sector or the call center sector as one of their priority investment sector. That means, they are focusing on the IT sector as their primary investment attraction. However, what has happened is over time, like I explained, the industry has transitioned and it has moved, as we would call it, up the value chain. So what has happened is a lot of these companies have started expecting more from many of these locations. And when we say many of these locations, they have started expecting more from the service providers who are based out of these locations. Now, when the demands in terms of making sure that your services are much more effective, much more complex in nature, started driving many of these service providers to locations where they would actually get a much better mix of, I would say, talent that would enable them to execute much more complex back office processes. So let's just take an example. A company would probably come to Jamaica and set up let's say 500-seat operations, which was predominantly voice-based customer service support operations. Over time, their end client started asking them to, let's say, provide some kind of back office support services and also optimize back office support services, let's say something like finance and accounting, while also asking them to optimize the 500-seat operations because there are new technologies that are coming and into the picture and so on and so forth. So ultimately, the demand from the service provider changed from, let's say, from 500-seat voice-based call center operations to a 300-seat voice-based call center operation and another 250 seats of finance and accounting support. Now, if that kind of an expansion in terms of skill set is not possible in Jamaica, a service provider would inherently move his operation from Jamaica to any other location where he could provide the entire set of services in a much more cost-effective manner. And that is the reason why, if you focus on just the call center or the back office aspect of the BPO sector, you would never have what I would call the stickiness of both the end customers as well as the service providers. So to come back to your question, as in, why are people getting paid, what they're getting paid in terms of low wages and service providers not having stickiness to a location, the primary reason for that is many of these locations have been predominantly providing services which have been low margin, which in turn means that the wages that were given to workers or employees would probably not be as high as you would want them to be. That's number one. And number two, as the complexity of the services expected to be delivered from some of these locations increased, many of these service providers found it more prudent to move from one location to another location just to make sure that, they cover that entire chain of services that their end client is expecting. And this again boils down to the very first question that you asked. Most of the end clients of outsourcing service providers are now looking at the service providers as not just a vendor, but a partner in driving business transformation. So a lot of these service providers are also constantly evolving themselves to meet their end client needs, which in turn means that a lot of these locations will have to start, I would say, figuring out how do we manage the expectations of many of these service providers who are either present or we are willing to attract to our location or our country.
Oh, Rejo, some excellent points. And there's so many things now that I just want to sort of touch on based on some of what you've said. So one of the first things I think that I that really had me thinking was the fact that 20 plus countries within the Caribbean and the Latin American region have outsourcing as an area that they're focusing on. But you also have the powerhouses such as India, Philippines, China, Mexico, etc., with which the Caribbean as a region or individual countries probably really cannot compete. So to what degree are Caribbean countries competitive in this whole, IT BPO space?
Well, the Caribbean countries are definitely competitive, and that is the reason why you see some very large expansion, in some of the more established BPO locations like Jamaica. If we take Jamaica as example, some of the existing service providers have expanded to significant scale. If I'm not mistaken, the entire Jamaican BPO industry is somewhere close to 30,000 seats, and a couple of the largest service providers make up to 50% or 60% of these seats. Jamaica is, like I said, is helping these service provider expand their current base, as well as attracting new investors and new service providers to set up large scale operations. So this is an indication that Caribbean does hold significant potential and is also very attractive to many of these service providers. Now, the only challenge with that is to obviously make sure that many of these locations who are focusing on the IT BPO industry as a prime investment sector are also able to constantly innovate. Now, when I say that, you need to focus on the various, what I would call the pillars based on which you build your entire BPO landscape. That includes human resource skills, that includes your infrastructure, that includes your legal and regulatory mechanism, so on and so forth. These are essentially the three key pillars. What most of the Caribbean locations do not seem to focus on is to make sure the industry is moving in time with its evolution as a much more complex, I would say, sector. So to going back to the key pillars, you have to focus on things like skill development. You cannot constantly focus on doing the same kind of work and having your skill pool do the same kind of work that you would probably have done 5 or 7 years back, because you would not be able to derive the same kind of value. You definitely need to focus on better infrastructure so that you can accommodate much more, I would say, much more larger as well as much more innovative firms who would need a completely different kind of ecosystem to operate on. Your legal and regulatory system should also be supportive. So all these things have to move in tandem so that the country also moves in tandem and in line with the industry growth. To answer your question about how competitive they are with regards to many of the other locations like India and the Philippines, many of these countries, especially India, it's a great example, and I'm taking this as an example not because I come from India, but what they have managed to do is very successfully move up the value chain to such an extent that they have become, I would say, the torchbearers, and they have become, I would say, a pillar or a milestone based on which the entire outsourcing industry moves, because they dictate the terms in terms of how is the outsourcing industry going to move, what kind of complexity in terms of services can be achieved through outsourcing of operations, and so on and so forth. But other than that, the Caribbean countries are definitely very competitive, but they are competitive in small pockets. So they are very competitive in something like voice-based BPO services. They are to some extent competitive in many other forms of back office services like data transcription and so on and so forth. But as soon as you start moving away from these specific segments, they actually start losing their competitiveness. And the only way you can ensure that you retain your edge is to make sure that, like I said, you have enough skills to provide some other kind of services as well. Now, I would like to highlight here that you cannot club the entire Caribbean chain of islands into one bucket, because there are locations like Jamaica which are far more evolved and have much more capacity to offer much more complex services to the end clients, and you have locations like Haiti which are on the other end of the spectrum where they can possibly do a lot of multilingual voice-based services and have a much better cost point, but would probably not be that effectively be able to deliver something like an FNA support service or a back office HR support service. So each individual Caribbean location needs to identify what is its strength in terms of skill pool, in terms of what it can possibly look at scalability, and then create a very distinct strategy around that.
No, definitely. There's so much again that you've raised, and just the whole issue of stickiness of location and the countries continually examining how they want their sectors to evolve, and what skills and what framework, what the enabling framework that needs to be in place to support where they want to position their sector as the whole industry evolves. So I think one of the things that I recognized perhaps about a year or so ago, I went to a conference and there was a great excitement in the industry about robotics process automation. Since I'm no longer as involved in the industry, can you let us know whether or not RPA is still something that businesses are focusing on, and how might the Caribbean be affected?
Sure. So, as far as the back office industry is concerned, of all the changes that we have seen over time, the emergence of what we call disruptive technologies is perhaps the most, I would say, like it, like the term itself says, disruptive to the entire outsourcing ecosystem. A lot of the new technologies that are coming into play right now are so potent that you would probably not require as much human interaction or human intervention as you would otherwise need in a normal set of service delivery operation. Some of these technologies that I would like to highlight here include, automation, which is slightly different from what we know as robotic process automation. There are a lot of other technologies that are coming into play, like cloud, analytics, IoT, as we know it as Internet of Things, or I would classify three distinct categories that is impacting the current outsourcing ecosystem as we know it today. One is obviously this emergence of disruptive technologies, which in turn is giving rise to, I would say, some locations that are leveraging these disruptive technologies to reposition themselves, or in fact position themselves as an outsourcing destination. And then there are some changes that is happening within the call center industry itself. So let's just tackle all three of them one by one. So like I said, the first is disruptive technologies. Automation essentially is a result of what we just discussed earlier, service providers leveraging technology to improve delivery of service, again forced by pressures in terms of cost and challenges and again pressure to deliver value, where they actually started automating many of these services or back office processes that you would otherwise require human intervention. Now, when you club this automation with, again, evolution of what we call as artificial intelligence, you are also taking out that little amount of human intervention that was required. So when I actually club automation with AI, we come up with what is called intelligent automation, which means you have a system in place which is constantly learning by doing the same thing again and again, but also making sure it accommodates any digression from what it would otherwise be regularly doing. Let's just take a very simple example. For example, I'm doing claims processing. Now, the way claims processing would have been done earlier would, a person would sit, go through the claim, and based on his understanding of the entire process, judiciously decide, if a claim has to be approved or a claim has to be rejected. Now, obviously, that, like I said, required some level of human intervention. Now, with most of the process being automated, the entire process of submitting a claim and assessing a claim became automated to, let's say, a 70 to 80% extent, wherein the person assessing the claim would require much less time to basically verify the claim. Now, with the advent of automation, this 80% is combined with what is artificial intelligence, where a system decides whether a specific claim can be approved or rejected. And the way it does is, obviously, it's doing the same thing again and again, and it is accumulating the knowledge of having processed millions of transactions to decide whether a specific transaction can be approved or not, which further completely eliminates, I would not say completely, but to a very large extent, eliminate the human factor where we would have used human judgment to decide whether a claim has to be processed or not. So that kind of gives you an idea about how drastic a change the outsourcing industry is going to face because of things like automation and emergence of artificial intelligence. Now, just about a couple of years back, these technologies would have been very costly for some of the service providers to adopt and obviously the end clients to pay for it. But over time, adoption of automation, adoption of AI as part of a process has become much more cheaper, which essentially means, it's much easier to roll out these automation processes in turn, which means that many of these service providers would not need the kind of employment that they would have otherwise, required to do the same amount of work. So just to give you an example, we are talking to a very large conglomerate right now, as part of our advisory business, where we're trying to help them streamline their entire payroll processing. Now, this firm is very large. It has about 12,000 employees across, I think, close to 10 countries. Now, based on our assessment, if they actually adopt some of these automation processes and automation technologies, the payroll processing for this entire employee base of 12,000 people could actually be done by just 5 people over half a day.
Wow.
Which means a bunch of 5 folks can actually do the entire payroll processing. If everybody has to be paid on the 30th, on maybe midday 30th, they start working on processing the payroll, and by the end of the day, everybody would have got their pays, and this is just done by 5 people. Again, because of these technologies, a lot of the countries, this is the second aspect, a lot of the countries that we would otherwise not associate with as an outsourcing location have been enabled to provide these services in a much more effective manner than what they would have otherwise been able to do. So just to give you another example, let's take again the example of Haiti. Haiti, we know it has a lot of challenges, especially infrastructural challenges, which has limited the capability of the country as well as service providers to basically leverage the immense skills that they have in terms of their human resources. However, with the emergence of cloud, this problem can effectively be solved in a very efficient manner. So once you have cloud as a supporting element to your service delivery, you can pretty much have your entire IT infrastructure hosted on cloud, in turn effectively eliminating anything that you would otherwise need to a very large extent locally in Haiti, which means I have my entire IT infrastructure hosted on cloud, which in turn is connected to Haiti. So all I'm looking at is some very strong bandwidth, and I can start providing French, Creole, English, Spanish, all sorts of support that I can provide leveraging the skills that are available locally in Haiti, which essentially means Haiti can also become a very effective back office service provider, which it would have possibly not been able to do had we not had something like cloud coming into the picture. So these are some of the key trends that are affecting the industry, and which in turn is actually creating what I would say or forcing a tectonic shift in how the entire BPO industry is functioning. And obviously there are some very call center specific trends like omni-channel services, where some of the service providers are expected not to just provide voice-based services, but also email, chat, social media support, all at the same time, which essentially means that you have to really reconfigure how you run your operations. So if you are running your operations in Jamaica and you're just doing voice-based support, your end client is now expecting you to provide other kind of channel supports, like I just mentioned, from Jamaica, which essentially again boils down to the need to retrain your entire skill base to accommodate the changes in terms of enabling them to provide other kind of customer service, channels and support other kind of customer service channels. So all in all, these are some very interesting times for the entire call center BPO industry, and obviously these trends are going to have a very profound impact, and it already has started having a profound impact because we do not see many of the service providers growing as fast as they would grow in terms of human resource expansion. they're growing in terms of revenue because they are making much more money offering higher value services and at a much more cost effective manner, but they are not really expanding in terms of the employment base. And in fact, I will again draw a very interesting parallel with India. Again, for the first time ever in the history of Indian outsourcing industry, which is easily about 20 to 25 years, over the past 2 quarters, they have actually seen almost zero employee growth, which just to put into perspective, the Indian IT BPO industry would hire close to 25 to 30,000 people every quarter. But over the past 2 to 3 quarters, they are seeing very, very subdued growth, where either the hiring is almost zero or just about slightly higher than zero, simply because most of the service providers are not expanding the way they are or they would have expanded earlier, because your human resource scalability is not a key factor anymore for you to effectively provide your services to the end client. Michelle?
Yes, Rejo, thank you so much for that. There's a lot going on in the industry, and I am, even just as you said, I think that we are going to be living in very interesting times, especially since many Caribbean countries are looking for the outsourcing industry to really bolster their economies. So I'm just thinking, to wrap up, since we probably need to draw this session to a close. We can probably talk about so many different aspects for a good few hours, but probably just to wrap up, and based on even many of the things that you have said, what would be probably the 2 or 3 things, even if you want to go up to 5, that you think the region should be doing? Should they focus on specific sectors? Should they be looking more at, as you said, stickiness of their locations? What can you just give us some probably specific advice? Well, probably not so specific, since we're just dealing with the region as a whole as opposed to individual countries, that perhaps countries should consider to help them to develop what might be their longer term strategy for outsourcing?
Sure. So first, what I would recommend is not to think of your country or your location or your island and position it as a cost-effective location. Now, like I said, cost is still a considerable factor, but we need to start thinking beyond positioning ourselves as a cost-saving location, because cost is not really the key driving factor anymore. Now, as soon as you do that, there are a few things that you would have to do to ensure that you have a much more vibrant and much more complex set of services offerings. So the first thing you definitely need to focus is to improve the skill pool and the skill base, which essentially means you would have to work with the local universities, local schools, and so on and so forth, so that there is a critical skill pool of resources that can offer some of these higher value services, so that a service provider is not turned down because he does not see the potential of scaling that specific, I would say, subsegment that he is looking to scale. So skill development is obviously the first and the most important aspect. Again, what I have seen, especially in the Caribbean region, is there is actually a gap between what is taught in the university and what is relevant to the BPO industry. So, developing of short-term courses, specific, I would say, short courses that deal with a specific segment of the BPO industry. For example, short courses on finance and accounting, or HR processes, or payroll processing, is something that some of the countries should definitely aim as a supplement to their larger scale base. That's one thing. The other thing is to also foster innovation, and that is very critical, because overall, if you would see the way the industry is moving, most of the higher value companies do not really have a very large employee base. You have examples like Uber or many of the other companies which are technology driven. You need to create an ecosystem that fosters innovation within your domestic markets, and the only way you can do is to support small and medium enterprises which come up with innovative solutions, platforms that solve day-to-day problems, and then support them in growing their businesses. So supporting innovative products and solutions is something that, again, is very critical. The third thing is obviously to have the regulatory effectiveness. Now you can use regulation both in a positive and a negative way. So just to give you an example, I know of a country in the region which is now looking at using regulation as something like a carrot and a stick to foster innovation. So they are thinking of taking away any of the incentives that you would have otherwise offered to a large scale call center operation and giving it out to smaller operations that foster innovation. And while it might be very painful initially, eventually what would happen is that would start attracting innovative companies into your country. It will start fostering innovation within the domestic ecosystem, in turn transforming yourself into an innovation-driven location than just being a value-based or a cost-based location. So that is probably something that I would seriously consider. The fourth aspect is to develop a niche. These services are becoming extremely commoditized. So it's the only way you can differentiate yourself is to basically develop a niche for a specific kind of work or a specific business vertical or an industry vertical. So just to give you an example, there was an attempt in Trinidad to position Trinidad as a finance and accounting hub because of the availability of a large amount of people who were trained in finance and accounting. Now, that is the kind of initiative that we would need now in many of the countries where they focus on a specific niche, or there are other countries which are focusing on a specific sector. So you become a specialist sector in providing support for, let's say, the banking and the financial services sector, or let's say the tourism sector, where you provide end-to-end services for the tourism sector, which means starting from basic ticketing of airline tickets or basic booking of hotels, all the way down to demand analysis, creating digital strategies around tourism, and so on and so forth. So you are covering that entire chain of services just for the tourism sector. So that way you're positioning yourself as a distinct tourism focus location. So again, service differentiation becomes a key. So many of the locations should start ideally thinking about where their strengths lie and then develop those strengths to become a specific niche, either in an industry vertical or a specific service horizontal. So I think these are some of the key things that we need to focus on right now.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Rejo. And thank you again for coming on this podcast. It's great having you on, and really for me, who have some history working, well, certainly from the national and country perspective in investment promotion of outsourcing in Jamaica. It's lovely to reconnect with that industry and to get a better sense as to where things are going, and certainly to be able to have you share your insights as a regional expert, an expert in the industry, but someone who is exceedingly familiar with what is going on in the region.
Thank you so much for having me, Michele. It's a pleasure talking to you again, and I hope this podcast will help people understand the nuances of the outsourcing industry and its evolution.
That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to the ICT Pulse podcast. You can find links to some of the things we talked about on our website, ict-pulse.com. If you like this episode, please show your support by leaving us a review on iTunes, as it will help others find the show. You can email us at info@ict-pulse.com or drop us a note on our Facebook page, facebook.com/ICTPulse, or via Twitter @ICTPulse. We hope you'll join us again for our next episode. Take care.